Imagine waking up to the sound of military trucks rolling down your street, the whir of engines, the heavy boots of soldiers, and the sight of the National Guard setting up checkpoints in the middle of your city. No, this isn't a war zone overseas. This isn't some dystopian movie. This is America, right here, right now. For generations, we've been told that our greatest threats come from beyond our borders: foreign armies, hostile governments, shadowy adversaries abroad. But what if the greatest conflict isn't outside, but within? The phrase being echoed in headlines and shouted across podiums is chilling. War from within. Across the United States, citizens are grappling with a shocking reality: the deployment of the National Guard not to hurricane-stricken states or wildfire zones, but to our own neighborhoods. Officially, it's about security, about law and order, about protecting the American way of life. But for millions of people, it feels like something else: the militarization of everyday life. Tonight, we're going to dive deep into this storm. Where did this begin? Who's calling the shots? And most importantly, what does this mean for the future of democracy in America? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why some are calling it the most dangerous moment in American politics in decades. In recent months, US politics has been consumed by a narrative that sounds like it belongs in a spy novel: that America faces not just enemies abroad, but an invasion from within. Political leaders have invoked phrases like domestic enemies and terror at home, painting a picture of a nation under siege from its own citizens. The centerpiece of this narrative is the deployment of the National Guard in major American cities. Traditionally, the Guard has been used in emergencies: hurricanes, wildfires, natural disasters, and occasionally civil unrest. But now, we're witnessing an expansion of their role. Soldiers are being stationed in urban centers, not because of natural disasters, but because of perceived political threats. To some, this is a necessary show of strength, a way to keep order in a country polarized by ideology, protest, and unrest. To others, it's an authoritarian overreach, a chilling reminder of how quickly democracy can give way to militarization. This is not the first time the National Guard has been called into cities. But the rhetoric surrounding this moment is different. Instead of being framed as emergency relief, it is increasingly framed as combating internal threats. And that's where the alarm bells are ringing. Before we can understand what's unfolding today, we need to look back at the history of the Guard, its role in American society, and the moments when its deployment crossed the line from safety into something far more political. The National Guard is no stranger to America's streets. In fact, history is filled with moments when troops have been called in to enforce order. Sometimes they've been hailed as heroes. Other times, their presence has left scars that lasted generations. Let's rewind to 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black students attempted to attend Central High School after the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. Angry mobs gathered to stop them. The governor of Arkansas used the state's National Guard to block integration. It took President Dwight Eisenhower sending federal troops against the state's own guard to enforce desegregation. That moment became a symbol of both progress and deep division. Fast forward to the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was met with waves of protests and waves of soldiers. Guardsmen were deployed in Detroit, Newark, and dozens of other cities. In many cases, their presence escalated tensions. The sight of rifles and tanks on American streets reminded many that the line between democracy and militarized control can blur quickly. Then came Kent State University, 1970. Students protesting the Vietnam War clashed with Ohio National Guardsmen. 4 students were shot dead. The images seared themselves into the national memory. Unarmed young people gunned down by their own government. Even in recent decades, from Los Angeles in 1992 after the Rodney King verdict to Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 after the death of Michael Brown, the Guard has been there. Always a symbol of control. Sometimes necessary, sometimes resented. The lesson from history? The National Guard's deployment isn't new, but it's always a political choice, one that carries enormous consequences for how citizens view their government. What makes today different is the framing, not as disaster response or riot control, but as a war from within. And that, perhaps more than anything, changes the meaning of their presence in our cities. So what exactly is happening right now? In recent weeks, speeches from the highest levels of government have described the United States as facing an internal invasion. The language is stark, even apocalyptic. America is under attack from within. Protest groups, activist networks, and even certain non-profit organizations are being named as threats to national security. This rhetoric isn't just talk. Across multiple states, the National Guard has been deployed to city centers. Officially, the orders cite security concerns, preventing unrest, and restoring confidence. In practice, that means heavily armed soldiers are patrolling streets, manning checkpoints, and even monitoring protests. In some cities, Guard units are setting up temporary command posts in schools, stadiums, and community centers. Residents describe the atmosphere as surreal. Seeing Humvees parked where food trucks used to stand, or soldiers with rifles where they once saw traffic cops. For some, this is reassuring. They see the Guard as protectors, keeping chaos at bay in a time of deep political division. For others, it feels like a step toward authoritarianism. After all, when military forces are positioned in civilian life, the line between protection and intimidation can vanish overnight. Civil liberties groups are already raising alarms. They argue that deploying the Guard in this way normalizes military oversight of daily life. What begins as a temporary measure could easily become permanent. What makes this even more intense is the media framing. Supportive outlets describe the Guard as heroes holding the line against chaos. Critical outlets warn of martial law in everything but name. Social media amplifies both narratives, creating echo chambers where fear and defiance grow in equal measure. And then there's the human element. Soldiers themselves, many of them ordinary citizens who train on weekends, are now being asked to stand against fellow Americans. For them, the psychological toll is enormous. Some feel pride, others feel unease, even guilt. This isn't just about security. It's about trust. Trust between government and citizens, between communities and the military, and between neighbors who may now see each other as enemies. When leaders call it a war from within, they're not just describing a threat. They're shaping how Americans see each other. And once people start believing that the person down the street is an enemy combatant, the real war has already begun. Supporters of the deployment argue that the situation demands it. They point to rising protests, clashes between opposing political groups, and an overall atmosphere of unrest. To them, the Guard represents stability. Look around, they say. People are clashing in the streets. Property is being destroyed. Confidence in government is crumbling. Without order, there can be no democracy. From this perspective, the Guard is not a sign of tyranny, but of responsibility. Leaders have a duty to maintain peace, and if that means deploying troops, then so be it. There's also a strong political angle. Supporters see the Guard as a symbol of strength, a government unafraid to confront internal chaos. For a base that values law and order, the sight of soldiers patrolling city streets is reassuring. It tells them, we are in control. We will not let America burn. For these Americans, critics are overreacting. They argue that the Guard is temporary, that their role is defensive, and that without them, the country could spiral into anarchy. In short, to supporters, this is not about militarization. It's about survival. Critics, however, see something far darker. To them, the phrase, war from within, isn't just a warning. It's a justification, a pretext for rolling back freedoms under the guise of safety. Civil liberties advocates argue that deploying the Guard for political unrest is dangerous because it normalizes military oversight of civilian life. Once you invite the military into everyday governance, one analyst warns, you rarely get them out. They point to history, Kent State, Ferguson, even international examples where militaries were used against their own populations, and argue that this path leads not to safety, but to authoritarianism. Critics also worry about the rhetoric. By framing fellow citizens as enemies, the government risks deepening divisions rather than healing them. Protesters aren't foreign invaders. They're Americans exercising rights. And putting soldiers on the streets doesn't solve the underlying issues. To skeptics, the Guard's deployment is less about protection and more about control, a way to intimidate opposition movements, silence dissent, and create a climate of fear. For them, this isn't a temporary measure. It's a turning point, a sign that America is drifting away from its democratic ideals. The Constitution provides both a shield and a sword when it comes to military deployment inside the U.S. On one hand, the government does have the authority to use the National Guard to maintain order. On the other, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 limits the use of federal military forces for domestic law enforcement. The National Guard is unique because it straddles both state and federal authority. Governors can deploy it, and under certain circumstances, the president can as well. That flexibility is precisely what makes it both powerful and controversial. Legal scholars warn that framing Guard deployments as responses to internal enemies blurs constitutional lines. Are protests, even disruptive ones, a matter of free speech or a matter of national security? Who decides where that line is drawn? There's also the question of precedent. If today's government can justify calling protesters internal threats and sending in the Guard, what stops future administrations from doing the same? Once the tool is normalized, it can be used and abused by anyone in power. Civil liberties organizations are already preparing lawsuits, arguing that these deployments suppress free expression and chill political dissent. But courts move slowly, and in the meantime, soldiers remain on the streets. Public opinion is fractured. In some communities, the Guard's presence is welcomed. Residents thank soldiers, bring them food, and describe feeling safer. In others, the response is hostile. Protests erupt at Guard checkpoints. Chants of "military out" echo through city squares. Media coverage only sharpens the divide. Supportive outlets frame the Guard as a bulwark against chaos. They highlight images of soldiers helping citizens, maintaining peace, or preventing violence. Critical outlets focus on images of intimidation. Soldiers with rifles, armored vehicles rolling past playgrounds, frightened families. On social media, the narratives go even further. Memes, viral videos, and hashtags either glorify the Guard as saviors or denounce them as symbols of tyranny. The algorithms feed both sides, deepening polarization. The result? Two Americas watching the same events and coming to opposite conclusions. For everyday people, the experience is confusing. Some feel torn between fear of unrest and fear of militarization. Others tune out entirely, exhausted by the constant cycle of crisis. But make no mistake, how the media frames this moment will shape how history remembers it. Whether this is remembered as a necessary defense of order or a dangerous slide toward authoritarianism may depend less on facts and more on the stories we tell. So where does this all lead? The short-term consequences are already visible. Trust in government is eroding. Communities feel divided. Soldiers themselves are caught in the crossfire of politics. But the long-term consequences could be even more profound. First, there's the risk of normalization. What begins as an emergency measure can easily become standard practice. Future leaders, regardless of party, may feel emboldened to deploy the Guard whenever unrest threatens their political standing. Second, there's the erosion of civil liberties. If protests are treated as security threats, free expression may wither. People may self-censor out of fear. Democracy thrives on dissent, but dissent under military oversight is fragile. Third, there's the danger of escalation. Deploying soldiers can inflame tensions rather than calm them. A single clash, a single mistake, could ignite nationwide outrage, just as it did at Kent State. Finally, there's the cultural impact. Once citizens begin